His is the inaugural address that is most memorable when in 1933 President Franklin D. Roosevelt roared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." At that time, Roosevelt was providing leadership and hope, guiding a nation through the first of two crises, the Great Depression and later World War II. We talk with a man who's been playing the role of one of America's greatest commanders-in-chief on Newsmakers. Franklin D. Roosevelt served a remarkable 4 terms in office, the man who lifted the country from the Great Depression through his government programs we know as the New Deal, also confronted the Axis powers in World War II. John Hammett is here as President Franklin D. Roosevelt to discuss his time in the White House. How are you, sir?
I'm wonderfully well. I couldn't be better.
Well, so many people recognize you as one of the top 3 presidents. Many historians, they typically rank them Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt.
Well, I'm very pleased to be in such distinguished company.
Well, what puts you in that company? You confronted 2 crises in those 4 terms in office.
They were very difficult to confront. I have to say, looking back, though, perhaps my greatest achievement with regard to the Depression was to bring hope back to the American people. I would go out and campaign in 1932, and I would look out of the back of the train and I would see all of these despondent people just standing there as though they were whipped, as though they were beaten. And they began to lose confidence in our system of government. They started saying to themselves, well, look at the Soviet Union. They're pretty successful over there. Maybe we ought to try communism. Or maybe we ought to have a dictatorship. In fact, when I took office in 1933, all the big bankers, all the money men who had created the crisis came to me and begged me to nationalize the banks. Well, I refused because I had confidence in the American people and in our capitalist system.
For you had dealt with polio.
Yes.
Was there something that helped you to lead? Was there something about the vulnerability that you experienced that you were seeing in fellow Americans?
I think when you're raised in a certain atmosphere, and certainly I had all the benefits of life, you began to lose sight of what the common people have to endure. Now, I remember prior to Eleanor and I being married, she was working for a settlement house in New York. And I was taking her home one evening and stopped by this home, this high-rise home, to deliver some packages. Well, after traversing up 5 flights of very dark stairs, we came into this apartment, which was a generous term, and there were all of these people. Well, I told her after we left, I never imagined that people lived like that. That gave me an insight. And then, suffering polio, you are taken down quite a few pegs, and you spend a year trying to move your big toe, and you see how vulnerable people can be. Not because of their wanting to be vulnerable, not because they are bad people, but simply that these crises come into their lives. And what we have to do as a nation, as a republic, is to figure out how to help these people. I've always said, the mark of our progress as a people depends not on whether we add to the bounty of those who have much, but whether we provide enough for those who have too little.
Every president steps into office, and there's always that first 100 days. What will I do in the first 100 days? For you, with 13 million or so Americans unemployed, in that first 100 days, what was it that you felt needed to be done?
Well, as I said, first bringing back confidence. But then, the next step was to take such measures as we could to put people back to work. I know there are those who are out there who have always said that, oh, well, FDR, he's the father of the welfare system. This giveaway to all of these people who simply won't work, who want to sit back and receive the government's largesse. Well, that's completely false. Because I said back in 1934 that this welfare, I called it the dole, was a subtle narcotic that sapped the will, strength, determination, and pride of the recipients. My task was to put people to work for their government on such projects as would contribute to the common good. Now, if private industry is unwilling or unable to provide employment, it is the purpose of the people's government to provide that employment.
So we're talking about an expansion of government. We're talking about deficit spending here.
We are. And you have to understand that during the Depression, we had to engage in deficit spending in order to create these jobs, these projects upon which we put people to work. Well, people were appalled at the level of spending. And they said, well, of course, we can't afford it, can't afford it. And then once we came out of the Depression to some degree and came into the war, the critics were saying, well, Roosevelt didn't cure the Depression at all. It was the war that did it. Well, of course it was the war that did it, because once we were in the crisis of war, we were able to engage in deficit spending to the level that was inconceivable prior to the Depression. So yes, they are correct, but we had to do it. We did not have the resources. But it was different then. I mean, back then, we were engaged in the Second World War. We were fighting all over the world. And we needed money to do this because we had nearly 12 million young men and women in uniform, and they had to be supported. Well, we came out and said that we needed help from the American people. And that's where the war bond drives came. So that once the war was over, we weren't paying loans back to the British or the French or the Dutch or any other nation. We were, by and large, repaying the American people. They supported us.
You stayed out of the fight in Europe. It was Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into the war. Why the wait? I know that your administration was supplying Britain, France, and other European countries with the means to fight, but at some point the United States had to step in.
Well, now, Patrick, you're a very young man, so you probably don't remember this. But back then, the American people and the Congress, prior to Pearl Harbor, were very isolationist, did not want us involved whatsoever in this conflict in Europe, which of course had been going on since September 1939. It was my job to educate the people of the danger that was looming primarily in Europe, to let them know that we were going to have a crisis on our hands. And so I proceeded. I could not go to war prior to Pearl Harbor because I didn't have the support of the American people or the Congress. It's interesting. December 7th, 1941, after all of the attacks and all of the phone calls had come into the White House, Harry Hopkins asked me, he said, Mr. President, knowing now what you know, if you had known then what you know now, would you have authorized a preemptive strike against the Empire of Japan? I said, no, Harry, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. We are a democracy. We are a freedom-loving people. We don't do that.
There are those with the government programs and everything that took place as a charismatic leader who accuse you of being a dictator and a socialist.
And a communist, yes.
How do you answer to those claims?
Well, I was asked by a reporter once. He came and he said, Mr. President, there are those who say you're a fascist. Are you a fascist? No, no, I'm not a fascist. They said, well, we hear you're a communist. Are you? No, not that either. Well, how about a socialist? Are you? No, not that either. Well, Mr. President, what are you? I said, I'm a Democrat and I'm a Christian. That's all.
What is your ideology? How would you describe your political ideology?
I look back to the founders. There's a very interesting story that Dr. Franklin used to tell, that after they came out of the Constitutional Convention, he was encountered by a lady of his acquaintance on the street. Of course, most ladies were of his acquaintance, but that's a whole other story. She asked him, she said, "Mr. Franklin, you've been closeted in there with those gentlemen for months now. What have you given us?" He said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And that's what I look to. The absolute philosophy of a republic, that we are all in this together. You know, there's this popular notion that the government is the enemy. Well, how can it be the enemy? It's our government. The government is there to serve the nation, to serve it by promoting the common good. And so, as the founders would say, you will never do anything to hurt your nation or your government, because that would be, as they called it, self-murder. That is the principle of a republic.
There are those, historian George Will says that the government is like a fine leather glove, and that each president slips their hand inside that glove, and that yours was a big hand, and that glove has not returned to its size, and it has remained large ever since.
Well, there's always this talk about the expanded government. I remember prior to initialing the first peacetime draft in our nation's history, it was 1940, the government finally got to the point where we had, in the federal system, 1 million employees. Well, people were outraged. The Republicans went on the warpath. How can government be growing to this incredible rate? 1 million people. But they didn't look at the numbers, because slightly under 1/3 of that million was comprising all of our armed forces, those people who were protecting the nation. Slightly over 1/3 comprised the post office. And so 2/3 of the government was either protecting the nation or delivering the mail. The other third did everything else.
When we talk about protecting the nation, World War II, fighting the two-front war that was fought, when you look back at how the war was fought, and of course the victory in the end, but how was it fought? And to put everybody to work and to get this country moving once again.
It was very difficult prior to Pearl Harbor to convince people that we had to prepare, that we had to build up our defense industries, that we had to initiate this peacetime draft, because people didn't see, as I thought I saw, the danger on the horizon. So that was a hard row to hoe. Once Pearl Harbor came, everyone was in. Everyone was supportive. And so we went forward with a very definite plan. Now, I have to say that initially, that plan did not include fighting Japan. We saw Japan as an annoyance that could be put on the back burner while we dealt with the real enemy, who was Mr. Hitler. We knew that the eventual victory would come from defeating the Nazis, not from defeating Japan. Now, we could defeat Japan, but that wouldn't have anything to do with the Germans. They would continue on. So we knew where the real danger was. We did not anticipate Japan attacking the United States of America. And I would say that there are those who still today say that we got caught with our pants down. And in many respects, we did.
Did you see what was looming in the future, working with the Soviet Union and seeing communism on the horizon as well?
That was a very difficult choice. As you may recall, I recognized the Soviet Union back in the 1930s. As Winston once said, he would ally with the devil himself if the devil were out to defeat Mr. Hitler. So even considering all the philosophical differences between a republic and the Soviet Union, and thinking about certainly all the horrors that Uncle Joe had perpetrated on his own people, we still had to help them. And eventually, we had to rely upon their help, because once the Germans were defeated, we would need the power of the Soviet Union to help defeat Japan. And perhaps the most important point, we would need the support of the Soviet Union to establish a world body, a United Nations, so that no person in the world would ever have to go through these horrors again. That peace could be determined across the table rather than firing bullets at one another.
Is the United Nations the institution that you thought it would be today?
I think it's changed somewhat, but I think people in some respects expected it to be a cure-all, and it's not, because it is composed of people with all their faults and all their prejudices and all their fragile frailties. It is a deliberative body, and I think it will work to a great extent. Will it ever completely eliminate war? Well, probably not.
Another creation of yours, Social Security.
Yes. 1935. It was a program, it was part of what we used to call the Big Bill, which we started working on in 1933. The Social Security and the unemployment insurance are the two parts of the Big Bill that survived. The other two parts, which we could not get through Congress, involved universal medical care for all of our citizens, and also the acknowledgement that the government, the people's government, would be the employer of last result. Yes? That we were there to back up our citizens. Because if you think about it, any nation that sits back and watches its people starve does not deserve the honor of the name.
As president, were you looking at history? Everybody says history repeats itself. Were there portions of American history or world history that you learned from when you implemented some of your programs?
Well, certainly there were. There were programs that were being put forth in Europe, ironically enough in Germany, that dealt with these social issues, these social safety nets as they're called. And I looked to those, but I also looked back to, again, the principles of a republic. We don't turn our backs on one another. We help each other. There's no reason in the world why people in this great nation have to live in poverty, have to live in slums. And this is why I came out with my second Bill of Rights, January 1944, my address to Congress, wherein I specified certain social and economic rights which would be available to all citizens of the United States, and most importantly, regardless of race, creed, or national origin. And these rights would help them, would provide them with social and economic security. For, as we learned with Germany, men in want, men who are hungry and out of work, they aren't free. They're necessitous. Yes, hungry men are necessitous men. They're not free whatsoever. And so, we have to do what we can to bring freedom and liberty to the American people in the form of security.
The Constitution in your eyes, did you?
Most people said I never read it.
You pushed it to its limits.
To its limits. I think you have to determine early on whether you take the Constitution and see it in one of two ways. I think it was when it was written by the founders, they did not see it as a shackle. They saw it as a foundation. And I often imagine, what would these gentlemen ask if they came back after 200 plus years? Probably one of their first questions would be, how many constitutions have you written since the one in 1787? Because we're a constitution-writing nation. Every state has a constitution. And since their initial formation, they've had several, over and over again. It's being revised. And so I think that would be an interesting question to have one of the founders put to us, and I think they would be shocked at the answer.
States' rights versus a federal government. Where do states' rights fit in?
It's a very, very fine line. a very fine line. Certainly states' rights are important. And when we established Social Security, I made certain that the Social Security portion remained with the federal government. But I didn't want the federal government to have all the power, so I insisted that the unemployment insurance go to be administered by the various states as they saw fit. And that was an important step, because the states have to be involved. Now, there are certain issues that come forward, and you have to determine, is it a federal issue or a state issue? I had someone ask me the other day, what do you think the federal government's position should be with regard to public education? I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, the only thing we should be involved in is equal access and equal resources. We go back and look at Plessy v. Ferguson from many years ago. Well, they got the separate part right, but the equal, well, that hasn't worked out so well.
Separate and equal within the White House. We can't forget about First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Was she a critic or a fan?
Well, Eleanor, she writes me these little memos, you see, and I always have them. There's a little inbox next to my bed, and she always has her little memos in there, and she wants me to read them over and answer them by the next morning, you see. Sometimes I do, sometimes not. But she often gets very upset with me because I don't act quickly enough. I've always said that Eleanor is my conscience. She sees things as they should be. As president, you have to see things as they can be. And you know she is very involved with civil rights, has done a great deal, even resigned from the DAR in 1939. Well, she wants certain actions taken. And she became very furious with me over this issue of the federal anti-lynching law, because I couldn't support it, you see. But the coalition that we had in Congress that allowed us to get things done was composed of progressive Republicans, and you remember the Republican Party used to be the Progressive Party, progressive Republicans and Democrats. Now, many of those Democrats are from the Deep South, and some of them have served so long, they've been there since George Washington was president, and they're chairman of the very powerful committees. I could not afford to offend those conservative Democrats by taking such action, because I knew that if I did that, we would never have another piece of necessary legislation passed.
John Hammett, you are playing the role of the president. Great historian here. You've been doing this how long, John?
About 20 years now, yes. Yes.
Fantastic. And you're with Colonial Williamsville?
Yes, I've been with Colonial Williamsburg Foundation now for 37 years. I'm now semi-retired, but I continue to involve myself, yes.
What drew you into this? You even have the laugh down.
Well, the laugh is really mine. No, my parents were children of the Depression. And so as growing up, I would hear Roosevelt, and they thought he was a god. And since one of my passions in life is history, I began to read more and more and more and more about this fellow. And I'm saying, you know, this guy was right. He understood what was going on, what was needed. He was taking the right steps. And more and more, I'm saying, you know, I really feel like he did, that this is what a nation is supposed to be. Not every man for himself, not survival of the fittest, but a republic where we're all in it together. We all own all of this. And if we don't support the common good, then we all go down in common.
So from your perspective, when you see what is taking place with the gridlock in Washington, you want to just pull the hair out of your head? What do you?
It can be very, very, very frustrating. And I always try to put it in historical context. I probably shouldn't say this, but more and more and more and more with the this inversion tactic where American companies are sending money and all offshore to avoid the taxes, and individuals as well. I'm thinking to myself, now I also portray Benjamin Franklin, so I say, what would Benjamin Franklin say about it? And I'm very convinced that Franklin would see this and say, these people are traitors. They're traitors. I mean, you may call them canny, and they may be doing it within the law, but hey, any lawyer will tell you there's a great deal of difference between what is legal and what is right.
John Hammett, you're also Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's been great, a great half hour. Thank you so much.
The pleasure was mine.
Bravo.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. We'll see you next week.